Hello and welcome to another Constance in Isolation video. Today I'm going to make some starch and starch some simple bits of clothing. This is just a way of making starch that I've used, that I sort of discovered through setting ruffs, but there's no reason why it can't be used in exactly the same way to starch other garments, so petticoats, aprons, gentlemen's or other people's stiff collars, and any other garment that you might want to preserve it. There's no reason why you couldn't use it on tablecloths either. I just haven't quite reached the stage of spending my time to do that yet. And I've got three types of starch here right in front of me. The one I'm actually going to be using is this one, Kershaw's laundry starch, which is the sort of starch you would buy if you were trying to buy some. This is the most likely what you would find, even if it's not Kershaw's. Other brands are exactly the same, and I believe this is made from maize starch, and that's the most commonly found sort of starch. This is Italian rice starch, amido de riso, don't hold me to how I've said that, which is readily available in Italy. I had to buy mine via an Austrian website that then got it from Italy, and it achieves exactly the same result as the Kershaw's, but because I've been experimenting with setting things with starch before, I bought some of that for curiosity, and who knows, that might be what's available to you. And then this I found on Amazon, which is Chinese wheat starch, which is, the reason I found this is because it would be nearer to what they would have used in the 16th century when I'm doing my Ruffs setting, but is not what you get if you buy laundry starch. And yet all three achieve exactly the same results, so it doesn't matter what you use. So I'll be using the laundry starch today, but know that whatever you can find, whether it's wheat starch, rice starch or maize starch, will achieve much the same results. So I've been really good today, and I've put a towel down on my kitchen service before starting. Don't normally do that. One of the things that is probably going to come up with me doing this is how I've measured the starch. So I have got the laundry starch, I've measured it on my scales, I've got just over 1 ounce there. And that's what I'm going to use. I have sort of also played around with my measuring cups, and I've also got one of these Cook's measures that sort of gives you all the different variations of where things would. So this is a bit like using the American cup system, but it's also got ounces and grams and equivalent things in it. It's not, I mean, that's fine for cooking, but it's not fully accurate. So I started off and measured out 2 ounces and then decided I really didn't need that much starch. So I've now cut it down to 1 ounce. So that is about half an ounce. Looked like 2 ounces looked like half a cup in the American measuring system. So surely that technically now means I've got 1/4 of a cup in there if I've now got 1 ounce, but it looks like I've got more than that. So to make the same quantity as me, you probably would want either, I don't know, maybe 1/4 of a cup, maybe 1/3, but it's all a bit, add as much water as you need, so it won't do any harm depending on whether you use 1/4 of a cup of starch or 1/3 of a cup of starch. I think half a cup might be overkill in this situation. So there we are, that's my starch measured out in there, ready to use. So what I'm going to starch today is these 2 gentlemen's shirt collars. I don't think they're anything special. I should probably think about that before I do it. No, they just say they're made out of woven Egyptian cotton. They're made by Van Heusen, which was a shirt company. They are a size 15, so that's to fit a 15-inch collar. So that's probably a 14.5-inch neck. So they're probably quite small in that case then. They're very nicely made, but they're nothing special. They'd probably fit me actually, so that's probably why I found them lying around. And they're not freshly washed, but they're definitely not as stiff as you would expect a shirt collar to be if you were going to wear it. So I'm going to use them. I've also I went on a rummage upstairs and found a unstarched ruff. This is a ruff I have no recollection of making. It's in a fairly normal normal sort of 1560s style ruff. It's been handmade by me, and at the moment you can see and hear it's completely soft. As it's finished, there's been nothing done to it yet, and it needs the starch to make it stiff, so we can shape it into figure of eights with the irons. I also have here a handmade 16th century partlet. So this is, the frill on this is box pleated. Ignore that on the historical costuming front. I made this many years ago to try and achieve the look of a partlet, and I have since learned that they would not have box pleated them, even though that's what it looks like. They would have been made much in the same style as a ruff, but we'll ignore that for now. And we're going to starch this as well so that the collar can be set to give the look of it being a ruff. But I'm not sure how much partlets were starched and set. There's definitely pictures of them from the late 16th century, early 17th century being dried on washing lines with other garments that would be starched, like a ruff. But the reason I picked this is because it has got some plain fabric, so you can see the effect of the starch on that, not just either gathered or pleated fabric like a ruff. If you wanted to starch a petticoat, I would starch it in exactly the same way. You would just probably need a larger saucepan. I'm going to use a fairly normal sized one for this, and you would need to use quite a large one to starch a petticoat. So ideally you would do this after you've washed your clothes, so that they would still be damp, but I'm starting with completely dry garments, so I've just put them in a bowl of water to get them wet. Now I will take them out, I will wring them out and get them so that they are damp, not soaking. So you don't want there to be too much water on the garment when you're starching it, because that'll dilute the starch. So I'm going to take these out, wring them out, and then leave them on the towel just to sort of dry off a little bit. If you could ideally get your garment when it was just damp, so out of the washing machine after a good spin, maybe hung up for a little while and then just work with it damp, that would be perfect, but we'll work with what we've got today. Here are the 4 garments. They've been in water, I've wrung them out, and I've just left them on a towel just to absorb any excess moisture on them before I make the starch, so they can stay there while I get on with that. So it turns out I am woefully underprepared for trying to film anything from a overhead perspective. So please take this as the learning curve that it is. So once you have weighed out your starch, you need to have a saucepan on a low to medium heat. I'd start off fairly low. I'm using the Argo, which has a simmer plate and a boiling plate, and I'm using the simmer plate, which is actually, it's a little bit too hot for what we're trying to do. So if you're cooking with a normal electric cooker or a gas burner, start off nice and low temperature, and you can gradually add more and more heat as you need. The key is that you are cooking the starch, but you want to cook it really slowly so you don't burn it or turn it to a big jelly lump in one go. So to start with, you're going to need a saucepan. So I'm going to put mine on the hot plate or the simmer plate. Then I'm going to put my starch in. And then you need a spatula or a spoon and a little bit of cold water. And you also need to have a kettle of hot water that's just come to the boil, but keep that to one side, you don't add that right away. So start with adding a little bit of cold water to your starch and mix it together to create a paste. It's a little bit like if you're making, because it is a starch, it's a little bit like if you're making custard or a white sauce, so you don't want it lumpy, and it will add a little bit of resistance when you start mixing it, but you want to incorporate all of the mixture with all of the powder with the water and make it into a sort of stiff paste. And this is with the cold water. You could even do this bit before you put it on the heat if you want to. You don't have to do this bit over the cooker. So once you've got everything incorporated into a thick gooey paste like that, That's it. You can now add more water. And I'm going to add hot water now. But you want to add this quite slowly, and I'm not quite sure how much. I normally just add it till I get the right consistency, but so if you just have a kettle of hot water and start adding a little bit like that and working it in, that's it. And then once all of the water's into the paste, you can add a little bit more. And then a little bit more. I have put an apron on to do this. I'd say that's quite sensible. It won't damage your clothes, but it does take washing to remove the starch, and you will find that your clothes will have little globs of starch on them. You don't want to add your water all at once because you'll end up with it sort of forming into lumps. So as you can see, I'm keeping it all moving. And I don't want it to get too lumpy, so that's it. So you'll also notice that it goes from being quite white to it starts going a bit gelatinous and jelly-like, and that's what you want. But you want it to do that gradually, because if you do it too quickly, you end up with sort of solid lumps and translucent lumps and jelly lumps, and you actually want all of the paste to be even. So it's a little bit lumpy what I've got going here, so just keep stirring and just keep adding the hot water slowly. The other thing it also starts to look like is wallpaper paste, and you want it as clear and as translucent as possible. So if you leave it really white and powdery rather than jelly and gelatinous, when you plunge your garments into the starch, you'll find that when they dry, if it's a really white powdery mixture, you'll be left with a powdery starchy residue that will sit on top of the fabric once it's dried. Whereas if you cook it and get it nice and gooey and jelly-like, it somehow manages to dry much more transparent, and so you can't, and it leaves your fabric sort of coated in starch, but not powdery. So that's what we're aiming for. If you find you have got your starch a bit lumpy, I have also sieved it in the past to get rid of the worst of the lumps, but that's a bit of a tedious job, so it's better if you can just make it a sort of consistent, as smooth a consistency as possible. Not as smooth as I would have liked, I'll be honest. But that is the advantage. If you make quite a lot, you can work round what you've got. This is also one of those jobs you can never quite tell how long it's going to take. If you get the temperature and the consistency right, sometimes you can do it really quickly, and actually the act of pouring the hot water into the starch does the cooking and the gelatifying it for you, and sometimes you have to work with it longer over the heat. may have overdone it with the water there, so I'll just keep stirring to get it as smooth as possible. And you can now see I'm splashing it all over the cooker, which is quite normal. I do that. You will find you have to clear up afterwards. That's partly why I've got a towel down on the surface as well. As you can see, I have speeded this bit up to take away some of the tediousness of the starch making. I will tell you how long I cooked it for overall, so you have an idea if you have a go at making it yourself. Keep those lumps out. Yeah, so if you get a particularly lumpy bit, you can beat it against the side of the saucepan to get it to dissolve and absorb better. Well, I'm aware I've not been very helpful in water quantities. I think I had a little bit of cold water to dissolve the paste, and then a kettle full of boiling water to make up the starch. It really is a sort of trial and error thing. I think I have worked it out on paper before that however much starch you use, you need double that quantity of water. So if you're having 4 ounces of starch, you need 8 ounces of water. But then I usually find you probably need a little bit more, but it's just that little bit more is just how thick a consistency you want it to be and how strong you want the starch to be. This is going to be a consistency for starching collars and cuffs and ruffs. If you were starching petticoats, you might not need it quite as thick as this. You could add, double that water, maybe. So I said 8 ounces of water, so maybe 16 ounces of water. It really does sort of depend on what you're doing and a little bit of trial and error. That's definitely enough water for me now. So now it's just a case of cooking and stirring until it becomes as transparent and gelatinous as possible. So I'm not sure if it's looking any different from your perspective up there, but I've been cooking it now for about 10-11 minutes and it's starting to go a bit more transparent and a bit more gelatinous. So hopefully maybe another 5 minutes and we should be there. It's a little bit lumpier than I would have liked, which is why I would recommend making a larger quantity than you need, because you can sort of work around those lumps and make sure they're not on your garments. If I'd made a little amount and it was all lumps, it would be, well, it would just, it is a bit of a waste of starch if you've got lumps, but it's not expensive. It's not like we're in the 16th century where it took a month to make the starch, and it may have gone mouldy in the process, which was why ruffs were a status symbol in the 16th century, because not only could you afford the skill of the seamstress to make your ruff, the skill of the laundress to set your ruff, you also could afford to pay for the starch, which was made out of bran. So it's something that would have gone into food production. So the fact that you could spend your money on something that could have gone into food, into making starch, and then have it fashioned, have your garment fashioned into a beautiful, you know, figure of 8 work of art that would be ruined as soon as you stepped outside in the rain. All of that went into why a ruff was such a status symbol in the 16th century. Right, it's now been cooking for 18 minutes, and I think that's about as gelatinous as it's going to get. It's a little bit lumpier than I'd like, but is that not always the way when you're trying to demonstrate something? So now it's ready for us to take it off the heat. Do you see when I move the spoon through, it sort of leaves a bit of a trail? That's a good thickness. Not quite sure what that is. You use that as a cooking term as well, don't you, when the spoon leaves a trail through the saucepan. So I've taken the starch off the cooker, and it is now really hot, so I would not recommend putting your fingers or your garments in there right away. So give it a little while, let it cool. And if you have some rubber gloves, now would probably be a good time to put them on. I should do this, but I don't have any. The starch is not damaging for your hands or skin in any way, but it is quite drying. And I've got a patch of dry skin on one of my hands anyway, so I know that the starch doesn't do it any good, but it equally doesn't do it any great harm. So not to worry, but I would recommend it if you've got some. So I've carried on stirring the starch once I've taken it off the temperature. It is, I must apologise, it is a bit lumpier than I would like, but so I would recommend if you can get it as a smoother paste than this, that would be good, but this will be fine. So we can now put the first of our garments in. Now it doesn't take very long. I'll start with the collars, and this is why I've got a towel down on the surface, because it will make a mess and get splashed. So just put the collar into the starch. You can use the spoon and let it sort of soak in. It won't take very long. You just want the fabric, or the starch rather, to permeate into all of the fabric. So that would be, obviously now that I've lifted it out, you can see it's absolutely covered in starch. That's too much. Oh no, it's not too hot, so it's fine to touch it. So once you take it out, you can then scrape. This is where you can use your fingers. Scrape your fingers over the fabric to remove the excess starch, and just push it back into the saucepan. You can see how it's a little bit too lumpy, so when you're taking that excess starch off, try and get rid of the lumps as well. And just push any excess back into the saucepan. You could also have another cloth to wipe your hands on as well to get rid of any excess, or your apron, or your clothes. Don't use your clothes. And you can see, I hope you can see anyway, that it's quite jelly-like. So that should probably do. So then I'm going to lay that on the towel, scrape any extra starch off my fingers, and also scrape any excess starch off the garment, and then you're just spreading it onto the towel like that. I hope that makes sense. Oh, that's not good because that's picked up something dirty. Don't do that. The whole point of starch is to not make your clothes dirty. There must have been something on the towel. Right, the advantage of that is back in the starch. So once you've taken the excess starch off into the saucepan, then lie your garment down on a towel and use that to remove, again, any excess starch. That's now done. I don't know what that is stuck on there. And now you need to leave this to dry. So I'm going to put it just to one side for now until I've finished all the garments, and then we'll talk about the actual drying process as well. So here's the next collar. You do that in the same way. Okay, so that's the collars. We're going to leave them. Now we'll do the ruff. So this is the ruff which was damp, and it's not overly wet now, but you still want it fairly damp, I suppose. And you plunge that in exactly the same, getting the whole thing covered. Actually, you're not really helping at the moment. Let's take that out. So plunge the whole of the ruff into the starch. Make sure you get the starch into, and use your fingers, into all of the little tiny cartridge pleats and into the neckband as well. This is now absolutely ridiculous. You know, it's saturated, so you can sort of give it a bit of a squeeze and wring it out a little bit. But this is where it's important that it's not too wet, because obviously if you wring it out too much, the water will come out. If it was too wet to start with, the water would come out and wash the starch away, and you don't want that. But equally, if you left it like this, that would be too much starch, that you'd actually risk tearing your fabric when you try and sort of smooth it and separate it. So I go through all the fabric, working it into all the little pleats, and making sure that because it's so tightly gathered, you're not leaving areas unstarched because they're not exposed. So working it in like this. This is really messy, and why I would recommend gloves if you have them. Or doing it outside. Sometimes actually, if I'm doing a big pan of ruffs and I'm going to hang them up outside to dry for the day and it's nice weather, I would do all of this outside on some grass where it doesn't matter. Alright, that seems pretty well covered now. Make sure that you also have a reasonable amount of starch on your neckband, and I always sort of smooth my fingers down it to start the flattening process as well, because that's something you want to lay completely smooth and flat. You don't want it to dry with any kinks in it. But some people ask whether you starch the neckband on a ruff, and I do, because that obviously also builds up a layer of starch on the linen that goes next to the skin, which is the bit that you wear closest to the body, and you want that to be protected from the dirt and oils of the skin as well, which sort of prolongs the life of the ruff. Okay, so there's no need to sort of lie that as flat and brush any of the excess off, because you've kind of used your hands this time, so I'm just going to leave that to dry there. I might smooth the neckband out a little bit more, and if there are any sort of really visible lumps, you could sort of pick them off now. Actually, there is I say there's perhaps a slight excess of starch on that ruff still, but that's where you can really use your fingers to take it out. So last garment for today is the partlet, which is not a gathered garment. It's got some flat areas of cloth, and also you might not want this as stiff because it would be worn next to the body. So if you thought that this starch is going to be too thick, you could always add a little more water and water it down a bit now to make a less stiff starch. Or if you were maybe doing a petticoat, and again you didn't want it to completely stand out solid, although you could always take the starchiness away with a bit of water and pressing, whereas you can't, it's harder to put it back in unless you're using spray starch. So I'm going to work with it as it is. So here's the partlet, and that just goes in as before. And make sure it's got a nice coating of starch all over it. This is where you're going to, as it's a larger area, you're going to want to make sure you don't have the lumps anywhere too visible. Although if you've done this absolutely beautifully, which I have not today, you wouldn't have such visible lumps as I've got. And so because this is a flatter garment, I would definitely wring this out. Sorry, I'm making some really quite squelchy noises. But this is quite a messy job, and I quite enjoy it because I like messy job. I also like soap making, which has an added element of danger to that you're working with chemicals, which fortunately you don't get in working with starch. Alright, I think that's more than enough starch on there. In fact, probably slightly too much. Let's work at getting rid of some of that. Take the saucepan out of the way. And let's have a look at this flat. It would help if I'd undone the ties on this part, but I haven't done that. Let's get rid of the lumps. Alright, so now that we've starched all of the garments, I'll just talk about quickly getting rid of what's left over. So I've got some starch left in the saucepan. There's enough there to starch several more ruffs and quite a lot of collars. So, and that was working with 3 ounces of starch, so and a kettle full of water. Sorry, that's a really unhelpful measurement. So you can see that makes quite a lot. But as it is on the whole quite a cheap substance, it's not overly wasteful, but that is a bit more than I would like to waste. So maybe work with 2 ounces the first time you have a go, rather than 3 or 4. You could keep this and use it the next day if you have more garments to starch, although unless you're me with a lot of ruffs to start, I'm not quite sure why you would do that, but it does keep in the fridge for a couple of days. I suspect it will probably go mouldy if you try to keep it for longer than that, so I wouldn't recommend it. If you're going to throw it away, I tend to just throw what's left into the garden because then it'll wash away and biodegrade, or you could put it in the bin. I would not recommend putting it down the sink, but ordinary soap and water will just wash you, your hands, your clothes and your saucepan, and you're left with no residue, and it's only, you know, it's only flour based in the first place, so unless you have an allergy, it's not going to cause any problems. So on the subject of drying your garments once you've starched them, you have 2 options. The first is something like this. Obviously, not everyone's going to have an Aga. That's me and my strange perversity. So the top, when the lids are down on the Aga and I've laid the towel over it, you can then leave clothes to dry on top and they won't burn or scorch because they've got the towel between them. So there's quite a lot of heat comes off. What I will do, especially for the first hour or so, is come and turn them over, maybe like that. So, and I could leave it for an hour, and the same with this one. And they'll be fine. They'll just dry like that. With the ruff, there is a danger of the stickiness of the starch and the fabric sticking to this towel. So every hour or so, I will come along and separate out the ruff from there while it's sort of excessively wet. Once it starts, and also it gets a bit crushed if you leave it lying flat like that, so I'll come along and sort of reshape the frills a little bit. And the same with the partlet, just lift it up, make sure it's not sticking, but make sure it is drying, and you want it lying as flat as possible because it will make it easier for when if you don't have an Aga, you could put them in an airing cupboard, either lying flat, or I don't know what other people's airing cupboards are like. So if you've got shelves, I'd lay a cloth on the shelf and position them on top of there, and then come and turn them over or check them to make sure they're not sticking for an hour or so while they're still drying. And then if you're going to leave them, maybe do that for the first hour or 2 while they're damp, and then leave them overnight to dry. Or if you've got a lovely hot day, you can put them out on the washing line and let them dry in the air. And if that's not an option and it's winter and you want them to dry, you can also put them over a radiator. Ruffs that I find actually fit. If you put like a cloth down first, you can then fit a ruff in the radiator, sort of sitting upright like that, and they dry really nicely. So I'm going to leave these to dry overnight like this, and then tomorrow we'll have a go at ironing them. I hope that was helpful and made some sense. And here we have the now very dry starched garments, and you can tell by the sound that they are stiff and completely dry. So they've been actually on here overnight. That's overkill really. They didn't need to be there that long. But they're now, the collars and the partlet and the ruff are all nice and stiff like cardboard. So the next stage would be to iron them, which I'm going to cover ironing the collars and the partlet. The ruff probably needs to have its own video all to itself about ruff setting, but I have made some little videos that are on my Instagram about how you set a ruff with an iron. But rest assured, one day I will devote the proper time and attention that the ruff needs to setting it. So we're going to do the flat collars and the partlet today. Here we have one of the flat collars. This is the underside of the collar. This is the top side, the outside that would be seen. So I'm going to start with that facing down and press the underside first. You could use a pressing cloth if you want to protect your iron from the starch, but I think I'm just going to go ahead. Sorry, there's something under my ironing board that does that. This is a semi-industrial steam iron, and I've got it turned up to as hot as it goes. And I'm first of all going to press without any steam. Get the collar nice and flat, and I'll do the other side as well, just a little bit of starch to pick off there. Now the collar looks quite matte, and what you might notice if you ever look at an old-fashioned shirt that's been starched, or collar that's been starched, is they often look quite shiny, and I think that's a very particular starch recipe. I have read somewhere that you can add borax to the starch, which is something else you can add to other cleaning processes, but I'm not quite sure what it does. So maybe that adds the shininess, or maybe it's just a really good quality thick coating of starch, and the more you press it, the shinier it gets. So I'm going backwards and forwards, but that's about as much as it's going to get. If you can also use steam, but remember steam adds moisture, and moisture will neutralise the starch a little bit. So I do use steam when pressing to get things really flat, but remember it will also make the starch less effective. So if you so on this stage where it's quite crisp, a little bit of steam wouldn't do any harm if you wanted to get rid of some wrinkles. And then once you're happy with that, you could leave something quite heavy over the garment to flatten it. If you had, I've got a tailor's clappy which is not big enough, but you could leave that over for it to cool down nice and flat. Like a big heavy book would probably do a nice job. But that's it. Once it's cool, it's ready to wear. I don't know whether it would be then best to press it like this one. I've just pressed it down into the way you wear a collar. Sorry, my hands are in the way. Because I've noticed that gentlemen's collar storage from the 19th and early 20th century, they're often little round bags that the collar goes in. So I suppose you probably do want to encourage it into a circle to when you wear it. But equally, when you buy a collar, or when a collar comes freshly starched, they often come flat. So I'll keep this one curved. I need to put a pin in there. Maybe that will help. Could do with the collar stud in it, really. So you could either keep them in a collar box in the round like that, or keep them flat in a drawer like that. So that's a nice starched collar. I'll move on to the 16th century partlet now. So here's the partlet, which is a little overshift that you would wear. So if you're a lady in the 16th century, you might have your normal shift with maybe a square open neck or a plain collar, and then you would wear a partlet over the top, and they were often highly decorated and had a more ornate collar. And the reason that you wear the two layers is that the shift that you're wearing as the base layer would protect the more finely embroidered or fine fabric partlet from the oils and dirt from your skin. So it's an overlayer to make you look more smarter. This one really is nice and stiff like cardboard now, and I'm aware it is going to look a bit glaringly white on screen. I'm sure. Sorry about that. And it's also upside down. It's a completely hand sewn, so actually unless I look at the hem it's a bit hard to tell what's the front and what's the back. So I'm going to start with pressing the body, and then I'm going to press the collar. Sorry about the strange thing under my table that keeps making a noise. I think it's meant to be a cable, a wire that holds the iron cable out of the way, but I don't use it. It's never made that noise before in its life. I've just gone straight in on the front side of the fabric. You could start on the underneath, on the inside if you wanted. And because, speak and then steam, because this doesn't need to be as stiff as a flat collar or a ruff, I'm going to use quite a liberal amount of steam on this to soften the bit that goes onto the body, but maybe use a little bit less on the collar, which I'll want to sort of to preserve the starchiness for longer. I hope that makes sense. It is a little bit like ironing paper or cardboard. This shouldn't be tied in a knot like that. This should be on with two ties that you can undo so you can get it nice and flat. But this was an experimental one I made some time ago, so I'm just going to use this to press the shoulder. You could use a sleeve board as well, that would make it easier. think I said when I was starching this, I don't know if the whole of the partlet would have been starched in the 16th century. You could just dip the collar section in. But it will soften as you wear it. So it might feel a bit like you're wearing cardboard for one day, but it will get softer with the warmth of your body and your skin. And if you were wearing it outside and it was a bit damp, so that all affects starch. As I was saying, that's why a ruff was such a status symbol, that you could wear a garment so easily ruined by the weather. This is the sort of stiffness that you want for petticoats if you really want them to hold out your skirts, especially sort of the early 19th century, when you're moving away from the drapey, floppy Regency, early Regency, into the sort of stiffer 18 teens era into the 1820s, and then starched petticoats were used in the 1820s, 30s, probably even the 1840s as well, and maybe even into the 1850s before the crinoline really started taking over from all the frills. But yes, if you starch your petticoat like this, it would behave, it would really hold your skirts out. So that's the body pressed. We'll move on to the collar now. Maybe I'll do this from the inside. And actually, the more I press this, the shinier the starch is becoming. So maybe if I carried on pressing the gentlemen's collars, I keep saying that, the shirt collars more correctly. Right, that's the collar flat. Now I'm going to press the little box pleated frill. As I said before, this is not necessarily how they would have made partlets in the 16th century. This was just me trying to achieve the effect that I'd seen in some portraits. Probably more authentically would be to have a gathered frill rather than a pleated frill around the neck. First I'm just separating out the pleats because they're all stuck together with the starch. So once that's all separated, I just then press into the box pleat. So I'll work this way, trying to work out so you can actually see what I'm doing. No, that's not envision. There, maybe. No. I'm aware this is not a very exciting activity. I'll probably end up speeding this up so you don't have to watch the whole process with me trying to think about what I'm doing and how to describe it. But I hope you will maybe have a go at making some starch if that's what you want to do, and maybe stiffening a petticoat or having a go at setting a ruff. Maybe you've always set ruffs before with spray starch and now you think it's time to use the old-fashioned recipe, which is, you know, better for the planet if you're not using aerosol cans. Or maybe you just would like to give your work shirts, not that we're probably wearing work shirts at the moment, an extra crisp finish. But it really does protect a garment from sort of the dirt and oils of being worn. So you can see why people thought it was a good idea to starch your clothes. So once you've done all of that side, I'll turn it over and do the other side. Do the other side of the pleat. The frill on here is too small to be set with a curling iron, which is how I set a ruff. So that's why I'm just using my fingers and the iron to create a tiny figure of 8. I think I was copying the painting of Bess of Hardwick from the 1550s. I know the date's not completely certain for that painting. It could be any time between 1555 to 1558, which is also the time that you start to see the ruff develop, so it's debatable whether she's wearing a frilled partlet or whether she's wearing a very, very early set of ruffs around the neck and around the wrist of her garments. It's a really interesting painting. Obviously this is not a 16th century method of setting a partlet. They didn't have steam irons. This is an interpretation, shall we say. My mum, when she went nursing in the 1970s, went to a very old-fashioned hospital and they had to wear little frilled caps as student nurses. The uniform had not changed much since the 19th century. It had got slightly shorter, that was about it. And they used to wear these little caps that had a frill around the head, around the edge. And I believe they were set with a gophering iron, which was just an 18th or 19th century sort of development of the rough setting iron. And she said when she first started going nursing, they used to wear these little caps, and once a week they'd all be taken away and washed and sent to a lady who knew how to set the frills with a gophering iron. And she said during her stage of being at the hospital, the old lady died and the hospital didn't know anybody else that knew how to set the irons, so their caps stopped being starched and set, and they used to just have to have them, they used to just get washed, and the girls would wear them as they were. So there's a lot of, so she was the last generation of nurses at that hospital to wear the little frilled caps with the properly ironed frills. I've got some pictures of her somewhere wearing them. And that ended after the old lady that used to know how to do the ironing died. I always think is a bizarre end to an old-fashioned legacy. So there's the frill. I'll take a picture of it on the stand so you can see it as well. So I think the light's washing this out a little bit. So there is an incredibly well starched partlet. Now I'm not going to go into the process of setting a ruff on this video because it's already going to be about 40 minutes long and probably not that interesting. So we'll save the ruffs for another day, but if you were using this guide to starch a ruff, this is how you want it to come out. Nice and crisp. You can hear how crisp the starch is, with a crackle to it. So this little number will have to wait for its own moment of glory, but that's how you want your ruff to feel and look if you've starched it. here we have the collar just on the stand so you can see it. Turn the mannequin around. Have the partlet on the stand. I realised that it might not have been very clear of what sort of garment it was. So you'd wear a shift and then you would wear your partlet over the top, and then you would wear your kirtle or the bodiced petticoat over that, and then a gown over that, and the bodice petticoat and the gown would hide the fact that the partlet doesn't have any sleeves because the gown sleeves would be there. When I made this one, it's got ties at the collar, but I think I actually made it to be worn open like it's standing now. So quite like some of the Dutch paintings you see. But it has also got, as you can see, these ties, which are also very well starched at the neck, so it can be worn in the clothes style as well. But I think I actually designed this one to be worn open, as it is like this. So I hope that is clear as to what sort of garment it is.